Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. The SANS 2021 survey, Threat Hunting in Uncertain Times, sponsored by Anomaly, BlackBerry, Cisco, Devo, Domain Tools, ExtraHop, Gigamon, Rapid7, Samplify, and Sophos. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Matthias Fuchs and Josh Lemon. Both are SANS instructors and course authors. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, whatever it is for you. Very welcome to our yearly threat hunting survey webcast. It was a very interesting year, to be honest, as you will see pretty soon. I'm happy and honored to have been doing that again with Josh Lemon. It's a very good cooperation that we had over the last few years. So let's hope it works out for you as well here. So let's get started right away. See if that works. Yeah, so let me introduce Josh real quick. So Josh is a SANS author now. So he's one of the co-authors for the 509 class, which is the cloud forensics class, a very interesting class I'm gonna take pretty soon as I have time at least. And he's also instructor for the SANS 4548 class, which more than qualifies him for talking about threat hunting, because that's one of the major topics of that class, and also for the 4572 class, which is the network forensics class. So basically just the network side of what we do in the 508 class. If he is not teaching for SANS, which he is quite a lot, he's a managing director of Ancora for the APAC region in Australia, located in Australia. So Josh, I guess it's very late for you. Thanks for joining still. My name is Matthias Fuchs, and I'm also a SANS author, co-authoring the 608 class, which is the successor of the 508 class. And I'm in the process of writing the 4532 class, which is an enterprise memory forensics class. Besides that, I'm teaching the 4508 class, and as long as it lasted, I was teaching the memory forensics 526 class. In my normal day job, I'm head of investigations and intelligence at Swiss-based InfoGuard. Okay, so I'm running an incident response and intelligence organization there. So let's get right started, if I can manage to do that. I want to make you aware of one thing. This is only the first part of our series of webcasts regarding this threat hunting survey. Like all the years, there will also be a panel discussion, because we're always interested in what the industry has to say about threat hunting and how they interpret the numbers. And for that reason, we invite you to join our panel discussion, which will take place on October the 7th. So you got about 3 weeks time to think about that, and it will be 10:30 Eastern time. So a very convenient time, I believe, for most of us, but Josh again. So sorry, Josh. To dive into the content, what do we have on the agenda for today? So we're going to talk about the key findings. The whole survey was a little bit based around COVID-19. You know, when you look into the media today, everything is based around COVID-19, and obviously, as there is some sort of financial impact on organizations, as well as some security impact on organizations, with all people being home office and so on. I think that's a good topic to talk about threat hunting. What we are looking at every year since we started that is the maturity levels, because that's something we expect to increase, right? To understand if maturity levels increase, you need to be able to measure them in some way, right? Otherwise, how would you know that it increases? So one of the first steps to even realize something is going on there is to get a higher number of organizations to make their threat hunting measurable. And that's also, and I'm not giving away too much with that, something that is getting better every year that we did that survey. We're still looking into the toolboxes, because tools are important. I mean, I'm not that kind of a tool guy that trusts one tool, but also what we do is not possible without good tools in your tool chest. As I said before, we're going to circle back a little bit on how beneficial threat hunting is. Well, for that, we need to define what's the benefit of it after all, because that's also something that you would need to tell whoever manages your budget if you want to start a threat hunting operation, right? So what is the benefit of that? Some barriers to success, because there might be some directions where we probably can lower barriers, especially when we're talking about the next webcast, the panel discussion. So if the barriers are somewhere buried in the software, well, then maybe we can talk to vendors. Maybe one of the vendors is just looking at the webcast and maybe they will change something eventually. Well, you know, I'm sort of an idealist when it comes to that. Another measurement there is effectiveness, because it can be beneficial if you invest quite a lot into something. But if you also want to do it in an effective way, you need to have the best possible outcome with the lowest input, the lowest possible input. That's efficient. If you want to have efficiency in there, we're going to discuss that as well. And then the final topic is the environmental and economic impact that we see on threat hunting in the year 2020 to 21. I mean, we always have half a year, and then we're going to discuss the key takeaways. So one of the important things whenever we talk about numbers, and I think everyone has been talking about numbers quite a lot over the last year based on COVID, we need to do that for this survey as well. And there was a slight change over the last years, and we always have to see the results in the light of the demographics of that survey, right? And I want to point out a few things here. So first of all, you probably see on the right-hand upper corner that we do have some heavy weight towards the smaller and medium-sized organizations here. That is something that's quite normal, because obviously there are more smaller companies than bigger companies. But on the other hand, as we look into the further data, the vote of someone from a smaller company influences the result equally as the vote of someone from a bigger organization. So it's going to be a mix that's not normalized to the size of organization. That's just something we usually point out there, because that might have an impact. What I do like about this year's survey is what I see on the lower left-hand corner. Well, seen from my side, lower right-hand corner for you, is who participated, what the role in the organization is. And then you can see that we do have like a significant majority here of technical people who probably know how to do that threat hunting kind of thing or have their idea about that. But on the other hand, if we sum up all the others of the top four, all other three are more managerial positions within the organization, but they probably make up the same amount of people than the technical ones. So we see both sides of the deal in our responses. We see on one hand the technical viewpoint, but also the viewpoint from an organizational perspective. And that's very important to us.
I lost audio. Is that just on my end, or are other people noticing that too?
I think we may have
as
had.
We are shedding some light on people
no,
who can.
Excuse me, Matthias. It's Carol. We lost your audio there. Let's have you stop sharing your video, and that might help improve the audio. Looks like he's frozen again.
That's all right. I might jump in there, which is only fair. As Matt said, both of us worked on the survey together. So as he was kind of saying, that it's kind of interesting to see sort of a good spread of technical people and organizational staff who have basically participated in our survey this year, kind of spread across everything from some leadership and management teams all the way down to our actual team members who are down in the weeds and the people who are actually kind of at the cold face of doing either defending an organization or looking after architecture inside of an organization as well. We've also got a really nice spread there in terms of the countries where we saw lots of input from. As Matt mentioned, I'm down in Australia, so I'm always excited when we kind of see a good portion of Australians participate this year. But it's kind of nice. This year we've seen quite a lovely spread across the globe in terms of different regions where we've had participants actually provide input to the survey, which is brilliant because it just goes to give us a better view across the globe of what we're seeing organisations do as well. And again, with the industries where organisations have come from or participants have come from, a relatively sort of even spread that we're seeing there as well between sort of government, finance and technology companies. But then, as you would expect, we're seeing a sort of a large amount of individuals from cybersecurity related companies as well, which can be anything from vendors through to industry professionals, all the way through to consultancy firms as well. And I mean, that kind of makes sense. I mean, SANS, as you would imagine, has a big audience in sort of that cybersecurity space, which is obviously not surprising. But also it's useful because it means that the input that we're getting back from individuals is from, again, those people who are very much kind of at the coalface of doing threat hunting across organizations. I think I can see Matt has come back again. We haven't got the frozen version. Was there anything else that you wanted to add to the demographics component, Matt, before we moved on?
Actually, I was just about to hand over to you. Sorry for that. I don't know what happened.
That's all right.
Now.
Not a problem. Okay, so let's get into talking about some of the key findings. Now, every year we do a bit of a summary of key findings right at the top of the survey, and we've pulled those out here just to give you a little bit of a view of what we looked at and some of the interesting findings overall throughout the whole report. Now, to be fair, it's actually hard every year pulling out key findings because there are some really interesting kind of stats that end up in the report and some really kind of interesting analysis between what we're seeing with the respondents. But these are kind of some of the key ones that are really interesting and we thought might kind of help shape the industry a little bit, but also help shape the view of threat hunting for individuals as well, for those of you who are doing threat hunting or those of you who are trying to support individuals in your organization doing threat hunting as well. As Matt mentioned, there was a bit of a focus this year, obviously, on the impact that the pandemic may have caused individuals. We're mindful that there's obviously a lot of information about COVID in the news, but we wanted to look at this from the perspective of what impact has your organization kind of felt this year in terms of threat hunting? Has there been some sort of impact, be it positive or negative, to threat hunting operations inside your environment? And overall, you got to remember, we did this survey at the start of this year, or sort of around to the end of Q1 this year. And overall, the organizations that had responded basically said that 11% of them had seen some type of impact to their threat hunting operations in the past 12 months. Now, this is kind of interesting, and between Matt and I, we'll be interested to see where this kind of goes over the next 12 months as well, as we kind of know throughout the globe that the pandemic is still continuing to cause disruption to businesses. But I think more so from our perspective, we're also keen to see how organizations adapt to this. It's not necessarily just the pandemic we're so interested in, it's also the overall operations or the impact to operations on a business. Because as you'll see, and as we kind of found in the survey as well, is that organizations see approximately 12 to 25% improvement overall in their overall security posture just from threat hunting. So we know organizations see a net positive impact from threat hunting in their organization, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. But it's interesting that we still see this net positive from threat hunting, and we're always keen to see what the sort of environmental or the economic impacts from things going on in the world and how that impacts people doing threat hunting. We also did see a slight drop in terms of the number of organizations that are currently performing threat hunting in this year's results. So we actually saw a drop in about 12% of respondents who have actually said that they aren't doing threat hunting currently. Now, that's not to mean that their input isn't as valid, it still definitely is, because as you'll see in a minute, we also talk to them or ask them about whether they're planning to do threat hunting or they're in the middle of ramping up to do threat hunting as well for their organization. As Matt mentioned, there's an interesting focus on things like tooling and what people use inside an organization to aid their threat hunting. And we see an overwhelming majority, 75% of respondents still have a strong preference towards things like their endpoint telemetry, SIEM, and also traditional networking telemetry tools as well when it comes to aiding their operations for threat hunting. We'll talk a little bit about that, but as you might imagine, there's a lot of that in the actual report that we just won't get time to cover today as well. Then in terms of how organizations are going with doing things like tracking their operations or tracking their threat hunt missions, we're seeing that just over half of organizations are now actually doing manual tracking of their threat hunting activities. Now, over the last, I think it's been 3 years now since Matt and I started authoring this report with SANS, but it's been interesting over time to see methodology and how organizations are changing what they're doing in terms of tracking or setting up their methodology for doing threat hunting in an environment. But it also kind of was interesting to us that we are seeing that pretty much just over half of organizations are doing some form of manual tracking. There's no kind of automation when it comes to how they are tracking and monitoring their threat hunting missions inside their environment. And as I'll talk about a little bit as we go on as well, we're also seeing, again, the overwhelming majority, or not majority rather, overwhelming half of people where they see their primary barrier to being successful in threat hunting basically to do with a lack of skilled staff and training in their environment. And we'll talk briefly a little bit about what that impact is and where that kind of comes out in some of the other results as well that's relatively interesting. So with that, let's talk briefly about the impact that the pandemic has potentially had on organizations this year. Now, in asking this question, Matt and I kind of had to basically foresee the future a little bit. So we had done things like write the abstract and write the questions for this kind of pretty early on when COVID-19 actually started to be a pretty significant issue globally. And when we kind of looked at this, I don't think we ever kind of thought or really had any idea how long the pandemic would run for, given that we're cybersecurity professionals, we're not infectious disease professionals or medical professionals. But I don't think we ever foresaw the nuances that could exist in how the pandemic could potentially impact an organization. So it was interesting that we did see that that essentially 11% of respondents confirmed that their organization had seen some type of impact on threat hunting inside their organization. And then we also saw 17% of respondents who were still really unsure as to what type of impact the pandemic may have actually caused their organization. And that's kind of fair as well, because we're probably seeing a level of people inside organizations who are still sort of finding their way through changes to their operating environment now, given things like remote working and changes to a lot of their IT infrastructure as part of rapidly allowing people to do things like work from home and work remotely. In terms overall of organizations that are currently doing threat hunting, we saw 73% of respondents say that they are currently doing threat hunting inside their organization. And then we also saw, and it's not up on the screen here, but we also then had 27% of respondents essentially indicate that they are intending to do threat hunting in the next 12 months. So this was kind of an interesting change from where we've seen respondents over the last couple of years. And it's fair to kind of say that, yes, the respondents who are responding to the survey have changed over time. That's a fair assumption. And also the number of respondents that have changed over the years has also moved around a little bit as well. But when we kind of look at the percentage of organizations who are actively doing threat hunting inside their environment, based on what we saw last year, we saw a 12% decrease for this year of people who are doing threat hunting. And based on 2019, there was also a 6% decrease for this year compared to 2019 as well. Now, what does that say overall? Basically, that sort of from 2019 and 2020, we saw this sort of gradual increase in organizations doing threat hunting. And you have to remember the 2020 results were from half from sort of 2019 and half from 2020, just because of where the survey sits. So we did see up until this year this kind of gradual increase of organizations doing threat hunting in their environment, which is brilliant to see. And then this year we've seen a slight downturn as well, which is probably not unexpected given the sort of environmental and economic impacts that a lot of organizations have seen. So that's kind of what we saw. We've drawn this out in more detail in the report itself, but these were kind of some of the headline things that we saw as part of the challenges in the last 12 months, and also some of the interesting changes in the last 12 months as well. So what about those organizations, the 73% that are doing threat hunting at the moment? How do they see things like their level of maturity, and what type of team structures are they actually using to perform threat hunting? Now, this is always an interesting question. We basically went out this year and wanted to understand in more detail what the makeup of staffing is inside an organization that is doing threat hunting. And you'll see that in this case, we see sort of 93% of organizations who have some person or some individual inside their organization dedicated to threat hunting, which to be in all fairness is just fantastic to see. Because threat hunting is often mission-based and has sort of reporting that comes out the end of a hunt mission, and also a fair amount of work that has to go in before threat hunting has to occur inside an environment, it is good to see that organizations are investing in in-house dedicated staff for this type of threat hunting mission. Now, also understand that when we asked this question in the survey, we did allow for multiple selections in this component here, because we understand that some organizations may have one individual or maybe one or two individuals who are their dedicated hunt team or their threat hunt team. And then also they may actually draw in supplementary staff as part of achieving those hunt missions. It's pretty common for us to kind of see that inside an organization where they might not have like a huge team of dedicated threat hunters. And so we are seeing just under 60%, so 58% of organizations that are also using other internal staff members from other related fields, basically being pulled in to assist with those threat hunting missions as well. Again, really kind of good result, and a really kind of good way to see that the stats bring through that there is a strong emphasis on using in-house staff. And the reason I kind of say that that is really good is because those in-house staff will know the environment well. They'll know what normal looks like, and they'll know what unusual looks like to that environment as well. So it often means that you'll have more educated people in terms of the landscape of your internal environment to be able to find threats generally quicker, or know what abnormal looks like quicker as well. We are obviously still seeing a portion of organizations outsourcing parts of their threat hunting, which again would make complete sense given that, as Matt was explaining back in the demographics there, we have a large portion of respondents who were from sort of those small businesses who may not have staffing or may not have resources to hold staffing for that length of time inside an organization to do threat hunting missions. It may be that they are actually a bit of a mix of someone who's doing security architecture, or someone who's doing cybersecurity uplift inside the environment, and then also acts as threat hunting every now and then as well. So it would make sense to still see a good portion there, the 37% of organizations that are using third parties to do threat hunting. The other thing that's worth mentioning here, and I'll just briefly mention it, you'll have to go and download the report. Carol's dropped the link for that in the chat for this session as well, is we also asked a question around how mature do organizations believe that they are when it comes to threat hunting. And to be fair, this is a very self-assessment type question for them. But basically it was on a rank of sort of 1 through to 4, being sort of immature all the way through to very mature. And one of the interesting things we saw in asking this question, when we sort of said, like, please let us know how mature you think your organization is, we also asked organizations to provide us a little bit of detail as to why they believe that they are at that level of maturity. Now, the kind of high level look into this is that 40% of organizations said that they were maturing, which is kind of a level 2 out of our 4-level option that we gave. However, in asking that question and then also looking at the results that people had given around why they believe they were at a certain level, we saw that a lot of organizations were still thought that they were at that level because they still thought they had lots of things like automation yet to build or automated tools that they needed to build as part of threat hunting, which was kind of an interesting view as to why they thought that they were still at that maturing level versus sort of a more higher level. We talk about this a bit more in the report, which is worth having a read of, particularly that section around how mature an organization believes that they are. But with that, I can't spend all the time talking about how a team is built up. I'll throw it over to Matt to look more a little bit about some of the tooling that organizations are using.
Well, actually, I'm pretty sure you could talk about it all day, but that's just not the kind of time we have right now.
I know.
The next question, that's one that we're asking pretty much every year since we started that, is what threat hunters have in their toolbox. So we want to take a quick look into the toolboxes. So how are tools located in the general idea of threat hunting? And we usually break that down to 3 things that basically make up good threat hunting. So one is visibility, so that's where the tools come in. The other one is skills, and the third one is threat intel. If you are missing one out of those 3, or one lacks compared to the others, that will significantly impact on how well you work on a threat hunting mission. So let's assume we are looking for certain ransomware actors now. So one of the things that are pretty common today in ransomware cases is that they are using off-the-shelf remote control tools. So I'm not talking about things like Cobalt Strike. I mean, they also use that every now and then, but now they start switching over to legitimate software, like TeamViewer, like AnyDesk, and so on. So if your hypothesis that you're building is that you have one of these attackers in your network, let's apply that to those 3 different categories. So first of all, visibility. I need to be able to check all the systems, right? If that's not possible, then I might miss something. The first part actually starts with threat intelligence, because I need to know, that they are even using those tools, right? That's when I start building my hypothesis. That's usually built on threat intel. And the third one is, if I'm looking for a certain tool, like for example, AnyDesk, well, then I better know how to get artifacts and how many different artifacts are available when it comes to an execution of AnyDesk, and what kind of intelligence I can further draw when I look into the log files of these tools, because that can be also very valuable for you and also for law enforcement. So actually need all 3 of these, because if I only have visibility into the network, well, what would I be looking for? And that's something I very often see when organizations only buy tools without having the necessary skills and the necessary threat intel. Well, one thing is, usually when you buy tools today, they come with some sort of built-in threat intel, so it's down to skills, right? And skills also means that you need to know what the certain kind of artifacts that the tool throws at you mean, and if they have any significance. Right, and that's a huge problem, and that's why people start drowning in data and sort of like making up their stories of what could have happened based on insufficient data. So you really need all 3 of those. That's something that that every now and then people might tell you that this is not important anymore when it comes to AI-based solutions and so on. In reality, we still see even the AI-based solutions strongly benefit from a skilled threat hunter to go through the kind of results that they throw out. So the tooling kind of category, that ends up in the visibility column in our ledger there. So what are people using? And I think Josh already teased that in the beginning. It's pretty much the same every year. Number 1 is the long established tools. So starting with a SIM, but now gradually moving into EDR. Maybe next year we're going to separate those categories to figure out what of these it is. In my personal experience, usually a combination of those two is something that's very beneficial, because some things are better checked in a SIM, and some other things are easier to check and more proficient to check in an EDR. Whatever it is for you, and that's one important thing there, don't let your hunting strategy be defined by your tools, because that limits you per se, right? So when you make your hypothesis, and we'll get back to that when it comes to measuring threat hunting, effectiveness, efficiency, and so on, don't let that let your operations be defined by your tools, because that might give you, or might basically steal the best results from you if you do that. So you define what you want, what would be the best way to go if you want to prove or disprove a certain hypothesis, and then you need to make the tool to make the tool work in the way you want it to work to prove your hypothesis. But don't let you be like limited by your tool. When a tool can't do a certain thing, it's not up to you to change the kind of approach that you have. You better need to figure out how to do that with that tool, or on how to work around that limitation of the tool. And funny enough, that's even something that has been around in IT for very long, and more on the management side of things, right? So if you would put that on the general security posture, what I was just discussing is something like a compensation, right? So a compensation control that you have in there. So you compensate for a lack that you have in your tooling. And that is something you should probably apply as well to your threat hunting tools that you use. And apparently that's what a lot of our respondents do, because as number two, we have those homegrown tools, right? So a lot of threat hunters use their own home-built tools, probably to get around the limitations of the tool sets they already have. And there are upsides and downsides to that. So usually those tools are very fit for the purpose, right? The downside there is they're usually not very well documented. And in my experience, they are strongly tied to a single person. That's probably the most predominant way of looking at that, or maybe a small team of people, right? In other terms, it's something that you could lose together with a person or a small team. So that's something you need to be aware of, and that's something that you need to control, right? That means you need to make sure that those homegrown tools, well, do what they're supposed to do. That's, by the way, also something that you need to do for the bought tools, for the off-the-shelf tools, because you know, very oftentimes when you get the chance to look under the hood of commercial tools, they are also like a lot of, you know, glue and stuff under the hood that holds everything together. So pretty much like the homegrown solutions, just someone else takes the blame if something happens. But if you take the blame because it's a homegrown tool, you need to make sure that everything is documented, that it will survive even if a person leaves the organization, and all of that. And that sort of adds a little bit to the total cost of ownership for those tools, because at first they look sort of cheap compared to commercial tools, but if you look at them and maintain them as well as those commercial tools would be maintained, then the costs of having those tools increases gradually. So that's also something very important to understand there. And I think we have to speed up a bit. So with that, I hand over to Josh, I believe.
Thanks, Matt. All right, so just a reminder for everyone as well, if you've got questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Carol's going to pick those up at the end. So if you think of questions as we're going through, we're going to pick those up in the Q&A section just at the end as well. So one of the other things we try to understand is how beneficial is threat hunting to an organization. Now, in the overall data that we got back this year, we got information showing that organizations in general, we have 60% of them that are doing some type of measurement in terms of the impact of threat hunting to their overall security posture, which is really, really good to see. And as I kind of mentioned at the top there, we're seeing organizations see anywhere between 10 to 25% increase in the overall security posture of their environment as well. And that's not just specifically looking at sort of an increase in incident response or an increase in detection or an increase in other type of defensive type security subjects, where it's actually seen an overall security posture across the organization from an IT security perspective as well, whether it be things like compliance or risk or things like that. We're starting to see some really good statistics around that show that those who do threat hunting see a general increase overall across their overall security posture. So what were some of the benefits that, that we saw organizations mention this year? Well, probably the one that kind of screams out the most to us was basically the increase in accuracy for detections related to, we're assuming things like their SOC and their SIEM. So basically increasing the validity of the detections that they're seeing across those types of alerts inside of their environment. Now, as an individual who has worked with organizations to do things like build out their SOC and build out their SIEM, and even been on the inside of an organization that has done that as well, having false positives or a large number of detections that are not useful or that provide low value to an organization is such a huge time sink when it comes to the skilled staff that you might have trying to triage these alerts. So the fact that we're seeing that 42% saw a significant increase in the accuracy of their detections and far fewer false positives is a really good outcome, and also kind of expected a little bit too. We would expect to see that when you do threat hunting, the idea is that you are threat hunting for things that you can't normally detect inside the environment. And the hope is that after you've done a threat hunt and you've tried to refine how you collected data or refine how you then did your analysis, where possible, you should turn that threat hunt into a detection as much as possible so that you only have to hunt once and then you can kind of do continuous detection after that point in time. So the fact that we're seeing an uplift in those detection validity of the alerts that people are seeing is a really, really good kind of metric that we're seeing come out of that. Not far behind that, we're also seeing obviously an increase in the attack surface exposure and also hardening networks as well and endpoints, which you would expect to see as threat hunting goes and finds anomalous activity. You would expect to see that there are things like corrective actions that come out the back of threat hunting to basically change or harden up an environment, depending on what is found as part of it. The other thing that we also asked about, which we just won't get time to cover in today's session, is we also asked about the methods that organizations are using to track the effectiveness of their threat hunting. So it was kind of a couple of really interesting results that came out of that. As I kind of mentioned at the top there, 51% are doing manual tracking, which is kind of concerning, but probably shows that there is a bit of a gap in the market in terms of being able to track the effectiveness or being able to track threat hunting activities for threat hunting teams as well. Okay, so what about the challenges? What are some of the challenges that organizations are seeing when it comes to doing threat hunting or implementing threat hunting inside their organization? Well, as the stats kind of show here, by far, 51% are showing that they have challenges when it comes to having skilled staff. And this again is predominantly around training or potentially headcount to actually have staff be able to do threat hunting inside an organization. Now, the numbers are kind of fall after this in terms of we see sort of an even split there of 43% of organizations agree that their other big barriers are things like limitations of tools or technologies or a lack of defined processes. The kind of interesting thing that we saw in this is that with organizations basically saying that they have challenges around finding skilled staff or trained staff or being able to train staff, is that the challenges that kind of follow after that, things like the limitations of tools or technologies or lack of defined processes or quality of data, a lot of those things would likely be solved better with skilled staff as well. So if I actually had skilled or knowledge staff who were kind of trained or skilled in the art of kind of doing threat hunting, it would likely help things like getting better defined processes, because you would have skilled staff to actually write those defined processes and work with others in the business. Or you might actually then have trained or skilled staff who can do things like develop internal tool sets. Although, as Matt kind of mentioned, there's also challenges that come with that as well, with kind of doing your own homegrown tooling as well. But it may also mean that you have skilled staff who can better assess the vendor landscape in terms of what commercial tools are available also. So it's kind of interesting that we are seeing that come out as the primary challenge, but also the challenges that follow after that would more likely get decreased if you actually had more skilled or trained staff inside an organization. Now, again, we wrote these questions very early on before the large parts of the pandemic kind of took place globally. But we may also be seeing some of this data occur this way with a lack of training. May also be due to obviously organizations focusing some of their spending a little bit. But it's interesting to basically see the result of having less trained or less skilled staff kind of then brings out some of those other items as well that could actually be dealt with if you actually had more trained or skilled staff inside an organization. So those were kind of some of the key barriers that we saw there. But we also looked at things like effectiveness of threat hunting, which I'll throw back over to Matt to have a bit of a chat about.
Thank you very much. Well, one of the important things, and both of us mentioned that already, is to keep threat hunting effective, but also efficient, right? And efficient means that someone is sort of prepared to put that kind of money you need to get that grade of effectiveness into your organization. And that's what it's about. And what it was a very positive surprise, at least to me, is that, well, a big majority actually, with almost 70%, are actually measuring effectiveness. So that means a lot of things actually. That means that they started out to map what effectiveness is for them, right? So what they expect from threat hunting, so that they can classify it effective. And even if they are probably not that mature at this moment, this is the right way to mature over time, right? Because then you have a key value, you have a value along which you can increase your effectiveness and your proficiency in threat hunting. So that's a very positive surprise, and only 20% are not measuring that at this point. And I can understand those as well, because it's everything but easy to do so. So it really takes time to get that up and running, and also some brain power, right? So you want to be able to get the right measurements early in time. So what kind of responses did we get there from the implementation level? We were interested if the economical challenges that we were facing last year, and also environmental. So when we say environmental, we mostly, well, mean home office and all of that, reduced travel. That's what we mean with environmental. And economic means really when it's about the money, right? The money for staffing, the money for tools, and so on. That's what we were interested in. And we did see some decreasing money available for threat hunting. But on the other hand, and that's not directly in these numbers here, we did see that the organizations are prepared to grow further. And that's, well, very encouraging to do that. What we obviously see is some delaying as well. So they already planned something and just delayed it for a year or two. So that was to be expected. So no big surprises there. But the impact, the negative impact on threat hunting hasn't been that big. And when we take one step back, that does make sense. Because to a certain extent, depending on the kind of organization, there might be additional risks, right? Because of people working from home, some organizations were not even prepared to have so many people in home office, lacking the hardware. And that way they sort of implemented some kind of bring your own device methodology for their organizations without having the right security posture to do so, not having any tools to control that, not having the right monitoring. And that definitely implemented some actors into networks of organizations of all sizes. And I think that's why all of us in the industry are looking quite tired at the moment, because everyone is working extra shifts to sort of help those organizations out that still suffer from those breaches that to a certain extent might also be related to limited spending and environmental changes due to the pandemic that we are seeing. So let's see if that works out. Always have a little bit of a delay here, but it should actually. Let's see. That brings me to the second to last slide. So here you can see the investment slide. I already teasered that one before. So there it's not working. Let me see. Interesting. Oh, now it works. Sorry for that. Is there any kind of change in investments overall? And the funny thing is, when we're asking that question, all of a sudden there was at least some planning that the spending would increase. So what we want to see in that curve, is that it gravitates to the right-hand side there, right? So this is the interesting stuff there. So we see threat hunting growing, and we're gradually running out of time. And I already said that, so I think I need to jump over that and go to the key takeaways. So hunting sort of increased despite COVID-19 and despite all the challenges that we had, staffing-wise, tooling-wise, projects being held up, and so on. So that is the trend that we have seen over the last years, and that's good to understand here. The tooling budgets go mostly into EDRs and SIMs, but also to a certain extent into homegrown tools that probably fill in the small gaps the big vendors are not prepared to fill in because it just doesn't pay off for them probably. Most organizations now measure the effectiveness, and that basically means that it will be easier for them to justify budgets, to train their personnel, to hire the right people, and so on. And these organizations actually saw an increase in their security posture, and that's not just coming from detecting adversaries with that, but also from detecting visibility gaps, right? So that is one of the major outcomes from detecting vulnerabilities they weren't aware of before. So those are really the key takeaways that we have from that survey. So it's really looking good for the future. And with that, we go right into the Q&A session. So let's go back to the screen. And Josh will take the first question, I guess, because I've been talking so long now.
So I think Carol is curating our questions for us and just collating those together.
All right, yes, thanks for that great presentation. We do have a question ready for our presenters. However, if anyone has a question, please enter it into the questions window now. This one asks, can you share further how you measured threat hunting for these results?
Oh, good question. So this was, you might remember what I was talking about a moment ago, that we are seeing a number of organizations actually do formal measuring of their threat hunting now, which is really kind of good to see that we're actually seeing that come through.
Josh, I'm sorry to interrupt. They just added a follow-up. They said specifically benefits and key measurements for effectiveness. So sorry, I wanted to add that before you went too far along.
Yeah, cool. And this is kind of hard to see, but what we have done is we asked a couple of key questions around whether organizations were doing some type of measurement. And then in the report, you'll actually see in the section where we go through of benefits to threat hunting, we actually ask organizations how they are actually tracking or how they are measuring the effectiveness of threat hunting. Because one of the challenges we find is that we kind of need to ask broad questions and understand what different individuals are doing, and then kind of slice up some of those results to see how they are doing those. And we also do things like ask that question I mentioned before around the effectiveness. We also ask why they believe they are at sort of that level of maturity in sort of a text format to try to get that information. But one thing that we do find every year that we have kind of done this is that regardless of whether it is the effectiveness or how mature an organization is or the type of methodology that organizations are using, we do still see a really broad spread of organizations using different techniques to measure or to basically try to align how they might measure or their methodology behind doing threat hunting. Which we understand is a challenge. And it was actually something that Matt and I were talking about earlier this week in sort of preparing for next year's threat hunting survey, is around what are some of the things that we need to try to dive into a little bit more detail on. And one of the ones that did come up is basically around methodology for threat hunting, because we don't see sort of well-documented methodologies that are kind of presenting themselves each year that we're doing the surveys. We're kind of seeing people use things like trying to map some of their threat hunting activities to the MITRE framework, but then also trying to measure effectiveness against that, which can be quite difficult and quite a complicated task to do. And given that we are still seeing 60% of organizations, actually no it wasn't, it was 51% of organizations manually track threat hunting. So in terms of some of the other options they had for that were things like automated, looking at time difference in terms of time to detect attacks and things along those lines. But when people are still very manual in how they are tracking their effectiveness of threat hunting, it kind of shows that in this space, I think our little sector of the industry still has a long way to grow in terms of being able to better track and better show the benefits. And I suspect that's also why you might realize that the spread I kind of gave in terms of how much improvement organizations are seeing, that spread from sort of 10 to 25% is a pretty broad spread, to be fair. And that may be because we are seeing varying ways that organizations are seeing or are tracking the effectiveness of threat hunting. So it's definitely something that Matt and I have sort of talked about and how organizations might do that better. And the reality is a lot of that comes down to having a solid methodology of how you threat hunt, and then also a strong methodology against how you would then measure that threat hunting against the methodology that you're putting forward, and then measure the missions that you're doing as well. And not all those measurements may be things like overall posture increase to an organization. It may be things like lowering the dwell time to actually catch attackers inside the network. Because if I can go from catching a threat actor from 45 days down to sort of 4 days, that is a significant win for organizations as well. So it's definitely something that we're looking at and considering how we can basically try to dive into that a little bit further. But you will see in the report that when we ask the question around how do people actually measure effectiveness, that there is a very broad spread of varying results for organizations of how they do that, which is interesting, but also a potential opportunity for us to do better in that space in the industry as well. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that, Matt, for that you've seen?
Yeah, so I mean, it's difficult and we don't have that kind of secret potion to do that. But one of the things that work pretty well is something coming out of an entirely different field. I mean, if you have a service dog who is trained to find drugs, well, how do you know that this dog is effective? I mean, maybe no one is on an airplane. You do drop some drugs into a suitcase, right? That's how they train, well, how they keep those dogs at bay, right? To a certain extent. And that sort of goes back to what Josh already said. If you do something like that in your threat hunting operation, you even get to those numbers in the first place, because you do not always have threat actors in your network. But if you set up a hypothesis, you better have someone else who makes sure that every now and then this hypothesis hits, even though there is that threat actor is not in your network, right? And those two groups, like planting certain things and the groups checking for those things, shouldn't be the same people, right? And that is it's not easy to do from an organizational standpoint, but it's the one thing that gets very, very close to the reality of threat hunting. And there, you can even make it a little bit more realistic. So for example, when you plant certain things in your network, then just randomize where you plant them, because that might even give you the ability to find dark spots in your monitoring. That might even give you the chance to increase your visibility or realize that threat hunting does not cover all of your estate that you want to cover. So this is a very straightforward way, even though it's not a super easy way from an organizational standpoint. It's a very effective way to realize if your threat hunting works out. Because in the end, you need numbers, but to get numbers, you can't only rely on real threat actors being in your network. Because obviously good attackers are rare in your network. Not so good attackers are probably more frequent in your network, because there are just more of them out there. And in that regard, you probably want to like simulate those better attackers. You can also do that in some sort of purple teaming and just add threat hunting to it. So there are multiple ways, but first you need to make sure that it can produce the numbers that you measure without without relying on a real attacker. That's important. That's one of the most important things. Otherwise, what you're measuring are just like metrics around how you do threat hunting, but not really the performance. So this is just what I wanted to add to that.
Yeah, it's kind of also, I guess, interesting from that perspective. Like, as you would kind of hopefully continue to do threat hunting, things should hopefully get better, and you should hopefully start to uncover those threats inside the environment. So, but potentially over time, you may actually start to not find as many threats as you kind of do threat hunting. You may actually discover actors inside the environment and start to clean that up over time. So exactly as Matt mentioned, having things like that type of canary in there to try to figure out the effectiveness of it is particularly useful as well, to continue those measurements over time as well.
That's also supported by at least our reality. We do measure the effectiveness, but we're also doing sort of threat hunting for our SOC clients, right? And there is a huge difference because when you have a SOC client who's pretty much baseline and all that, you usually tend not to find that much anymore. But when you then use the same techniques in some sort of a compromise assessment, I mean, you can ask everyone who's doing compromise assessments, which are sort of a hunting operation in the end. There in other networks, you all of a sudden tend to find a lot of things. And that sort of proves that point to a certain extent as well.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we have another question.
Yeah, there is, thanks. This one says, for an organization to be the most effective, is there a minimum amount of tools they should be using, or does that depend on the size of the organization?
That brings me to my favorite sentence when it comes to that. A fool with a tool is still a fool, right? So a tool is always there to support you in a certain, in a certain kind of work. And the main priority for tools there is giving you visibility. And you can do that with one tool, and others need like 3-4 tools for that. That might depend on the organization size, on how the organization grew. So, for example, when you have an organization that is pretty much streamlined on Windows, that rarely ever has Unix systems, Linux systems, then you probably need less tools than when you have a very diverse infrastructure. Then you might have some impact based on how the organization grow. If the organization grew out of mergers and acquisitions, you might need to deal with a lot of tools, but that doesn't mean you need them really. That's just what you get, right? That's the other kind of thing. But I don't think that there is a minimum number. So in other terms, when, oh, that's Cortana. Hi, Cortana. If we do something like an incident response investigation, which should give you an equal visibility that you would have in a threat hunting operation, we can pretty much work on one tool in pretty much any environment. So we've done it in small environments with a couple of thousand machines, but also big environments with 100,000 machines or more with just one tool. So for hunting, that's totally okay. Monitoring might be a different story. Josh, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree with what you said, but also to go back on something that Matt mentioned a little bit earlier on in the presentation as well, when it comes to tools and what you do with threat hunting. Keep in mind that when you do threat hunting, you really should not be limited by the tool set that you have. I think that was almost your exact words that you mentioned earlier. And when you kind of approach threat hunting, you really need to approach that from sort of an intel-driven methodology approach, where you go, all right, what are the types of things that the threats that might target our organization might do if they got inside the organization? And look at it from the perspective of what's the threat actor potentially going to do? Because I can guarantee you from the work that Matt and I do, threat actors are not limited by the tools that you have in your environment. They'll happily bring their own tools in and start to abuse an environment. So you really have to approach it from the perspective of going, all right, I want to be able to get this type of data to actually look at something specific. And that might be, you know what, I want to look for persistence mechanisms related to WMI persistence. And you need to look at that and go, all right, this is like and we want to look at this because this is what a threat actor that targets our industry or our sector potentially does to maintain persistence. And then after that, you would then go, all right, well, what data sources do I actually have available to me that might answer that question? And if I don't have any data sources, what tools or techniques can I then use to try to get the answers to that? So to kind of, I mean, that kind of a roundabout way answering that question, but to directly answer it, I'd say no, there's no kind of minimum set of tools that you actually need. What you more need to focus on is the data sources of where you can pull that data, because like I guarantee you, if you want things like WMI persistence, there's probably a dozen tools out there that will go and pull that data for you. But it really comes down to what are the sources of data that you need inside the environment to go tracking those threat actors and to try to uncover where those threat actors may actually be inside the environment.
Maybe one more thing that is also important when you gradually get better in that. It's not just about what the tool will show you, but also how the tool gets the data, right? There are tools out there that leverage the Windows API to get certain artifacts, and obviously they are vulnerable for kind of rootkits, right? While other tools come with their own driver and they're not that vulnerable. I mean, still the attacker could craft something that basically gets around the detection of that specific tool, but well, relying on the Windows API is definitely not the best way to go.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you got to remember the threat actor's goal is to stay hidden in that environment for as long as possible. Well, unless it's ransomware, and it's still stay hidden for as long as possible until you're ready to collect the cash from the victim. But you got to remember, threat actors are going to continue to try to hide inside that environment. So if they can find ways to do that by evading things like by either doing rootkits to basically get around API calls, or if they're trying to do that to basically evade detection, they will definitely go after that type of attack. And you need to also, as Matt mentioned, consider those limitations, because those threat actors don't care too much about your kind of really fancy tool that you've got on an endpoint. They are going to do whatever they can to stay hidden in that environment for as long as possible to kind of complete their goal or complete their mission that they're after from a malicious perspective. And I think we're probably pretty close to time, although Matt and I will happily keep talking, although it's pushing. We'll probably push through until the early hours of the morning, at least for me, if we continue to do that over here in my time zone.
You know what? Yes, we are unfortunately out of time, but thank you so much, Josh and Matthias, for your great presentation. And to Anomaly, BlackBerry, Cisco, Devo, Domain Tools, ExtraHop, Gigamon, Rapid7, Samplify, and Sophos for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.